a region of triple threats, challenges, multiple challenges that we suffer. And because of that, we're expecting migration. So these are the challenges that we were facing, but we try to respond. Countries have tried to respond. Responsibilities are supported in one way or another. Most importantly, the people from the region try to help and regional. So we see intervention in cross-border areas by support of international community, refugee areas, internally displaced people. So these are the areas that we are working. We have regional response strategy. It is working, and we are working on it. But from the framework of this COVID and after COVID, lessons for effective governance, sustainable peace and development, these are my takes. We can discuss on the points. Number one, multilateralism is still working, especially the regional approach that we were doing for the last 7-8 months was efficient and effective. We were working with African Union, European Union, World Bank, and United Nations. Especially we intervened in volatile areas that the border posts or the cross borders, the pastoralist areas, the migrants, internally displaced peoples who are the most vulnerable communities. So we worked together and we tried to combat this crisis. The second point, it is critical to strengthen regional and national capacities for crisis and disaster response. Here's a point. This region is one of disaster-driven region according to the African Union study. We have a lot of a combination of conflicts of crisis, but we don't have regional emergency fund, disaster response framework mechanism, and also in terms of disease, we don't have comprehensive disease surveillance system, and also early conflict warning. These are the areas that we have to work to tackle some of the things that will come for the future. Enhance the level of diplomatic engagement between the member states to keep avenue of peace dialogue open. Enhance development cooperation and coordinate crisis and disaster response. This is also definitely because of we are working on peace building, we are working with peacekeeping this region, so diplomacy should be a very important vehicle to tackle some of the conflicts. For example, in South Sudan, the peacekeepers, the dialogues and negotiations among the parties in Sudan, Somalia, and other areas, the diplomatic engagement should be a framework and the one that should be strong regionally, should be strengthened in the region. The debt cancellation is essential to unlock resources for health, socio-economic, and peace and security intervention. This is Africa, the region should echo the voice of this debt cancellation for our international community, since we are suffering one of the problems that this region is facing, is heavily debt problem that we are witnessing in the member countries. Enhance investment in conflict and early warning to identify and prevent, address emerging challenges to peace and security. So these are the major points. What my conclusion is, all challenges have its own opportunities. The First World War has given us the League of Nations, the Second World War, as well as finally created multilateral institution, the United Nations. So this is also a kind of international crisis. So we are hoping to have an opportunity to have a very strong multilateral platform to combat such kind of international crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those very kind remarks. I think you have introduced us to some of the main challenges facing this region, specifically the Horn of Africa, from political, humanitarian, migration. I think one important takeaway from your intervention, is the delayed electoral calendars as an impact of COVID-19. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, I have the distinct honor to introduce the next speaker, and that is Professor Eddie Maloka, who is the CEO of the African Peer Review Mechanism. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, my brother Chairman. I've been asked, of course, to contribute to this discussion, and I thought that I'll look at it from the point of view of the work that we are doing near the PRM, the work with our countries across the country, currently with 40 members. And I just want to say that from the governance angle, we made an observation that at the country level, in countries responding, countries in their response to the pandemic, that there were four competing approaches from a government perspective. The first one was what you can call the public health dimension. So across the continent, of course, ministries of health were deployed to respond to the pandemic. We were epidemiologists, ministers of health across. So there was you could say this massive public health dimension to the governance response by countries. The second one, of course, is what one can call, which is actually how it's called, the disaster management dimension. So some countries, in addition to treating this crisis as a public health crisis, they also dealt with this as a disaster management. I'm talking about the country where I reside, which is South Africa, where there was two parallel processes working concurrently in how the government responded to this. On the one hand, you had the Minister of Health acting on the basis of the national public health provisions, making some interventions in society. And parallel to that, and this one was the list ministry. It was the disaster management minister responsible for disaster management. And under that, of course, in the case of South Africa, there was a debate whether is this a national disaster or a state of emergency. And some countries on the continent actually treated this as a state of emergency. And as you say, in the case of South Africa, they treated it as a national disaster. But either way, so there was this national disaster state of emergency dimension, which has a lot of governance dimensions and implications. The third one was, of course, which was across the board, was the security dimension to how governments responded to this, which involved enforcement measures which are necessary to prevent the spread of the virus, enforcement measures that are necessary, rational, and in the public interest. And some of that also were put under heavy lockdown by countries. And then, of course, it creates to public outcry, but it's necessary. So the security dimension is also part of it. Then the fourth one is what you can call the livelihood dimension to it, which is economic consideration. Some governments came up with what they call the stimulus packages to try to, and subsidies or some sort of economic packages to support the vulnerable groups, the breadwinners, small business traders, and so on. So the livelihood dimension was also a factor. And then fifthly, you could talk about what I want to call here the social cohesion dimension. That while putting in place all these measures, which are competing, it's different ministries, different government departments, different interest groups, different actors, and so on, competing on who's the dominant element in the response or the national response to this crisis. Of course, there were issues of national social cohesion also, which came to the fore. The issues of which took the form in some countries of mass protest against state enforcement measures, the media outcry, and then, of course, the issue of public trust. So the countries that do better or did better, or this is still ongoing, do better is where you had a high level of public trust in government. So people believe that government is acting on their behalf, that the measures that are being undertaken, unpalatable, unbearable as they are in the public interest. So the issue of social cohesion is it's very, very, very important. As the APRM, we conducted a study. We called it a preliminary report on Africa's governance response. We launched it at the height of this pandemic, and we worked on it with the Africa CDC, the African Union Commission, and the involvement of APRM member states, where the Continental Task Force collecting data from our member states. And the report, of course, we think that it can be used to articulate evidence-based governance response in member states, as well as to facilitate sharing of tested approaches on the governance response to COVID-19. And then, of course, the study looks at, the report looks at national level response, specifically examining each country's response in the 4 areas: legal and institutional mechanisms, disease prevention and containment measures, social and humanitarian measures, and economic, fiscal, and monetary measures. The report shows that 51 states had, by that time we're doing the report, implemented more than one of these measures, with 70 states having implemented all the 4 measures that were examined in the report. And the report also, of course, comes up with the recommendations at the 3 levels: the continental level recommendation relating to the African Union, then the APRM national level recommendations, and so forth. And now we are working on the second phase of this report, which is going to be much more detailed. The first one was positioned as a you could say, a preliminary study, because we were working on it at the height of the COVID. The data was changing on a daily basis, and so on. So the second you could say contribution that we are working on as the APRM, we realize that the APRM methodology, we always say that it has anyone in value. There's even an AU Assembly decision to that effect. But we realize that, notwithstanding that, the APRM tool, even in our own reports, did not anticipate this pandemic and the nature of the crisis, etc. So we did not. Our tool was not able to prepare our member states adequately for this. So we then have undertaken an exercise in what we call building state resilience. So we are amending our tool to incorporate elements of state resilience into the tool that we use. We're already going to be piloting this tool in Sierra Leone. We're already working with our national structures in Sierra Leone. We'll be deploying a team there quite soon. But in terms of the architecture of state resilience, I'll be very quick because there's not much time. The first one is that when you look at this architecture of state resilience, you have to look at the legislative environment. It's important that the national disaster response to national disaster is based on the rule of law. That's very, 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 in order to avoid arbitrary state action in response to emergency. That's very, very, so the legislation clarifies, it provides for accountability and transparency, and also clarifies and involves the role of other agencies of the state, particularly the judiciary and the legislative sector. So in the South African case, there was a debate on whether they should use, as I said, the national disaster legislation or the state of emergency. But really, when we go into this exercise, then we're going to look at what legislative provisions countries have or don't have relating to response or enabling a country to respond to a disaster of the scale of this pandemic. The second one is the competent, existent or non-existence of a technically competent permanent body. So within countries, some countries have national disaster agencies, etc. So it's very, and whether these are experts, do they have early warning capability, and also that emergency, as we have to do our best to ensure that emergency is not politicized, it doesn't become a political tool, and so on. And this capacity should be able to predict and build capacity, and of course be able to design and develop scenarios for the future. And it's very, very important that this technically competent body exists to deal with national disasters. The third thing we'll be looking at is public education, because it's important that the national emergency and response to national emergencies or to national disaster is internalized in society. Kids learn about it in school syllabus and so on. I know, like in some countries where there is a rate, or you could say frequent occurrence of floods, or they live in the vicinity of volcanoes or active volcanoes, they integrate these issues into the curriculum and school syllabus so that kids and others, the national drills and so on. So the issue of public education, when we go to countries, we look at the extent to which public education provides or prepares society for, in our case, we are not prepared for this pandemic. It's nowhere in our public education. And then the fiscal revenue. Do we have fiscal revenue measures for bad times? We always say, even when you budget, provide for contingents. Do we have any, what we see across the continent is countries who are not ready even fiscally for this. And then a rapid deployment force. Some countries have a national, what they call the National Guard, and I don't know how many, in South Africa they use the police and the army, and none of them were trained and prepared for this kind of, and then of course the issue of regional cooperation is very key, the role of the regional actors. We just had a brilliant presentation from our colleague. We got the SADC did some work, AU and so on and so. So the regional response, we'll be looking at it as well when we look at this, when we conducted, you could say, the APRM exercise around building state resilience. So when we look at the extent to which the country responded. And then finally, I think is an issue that we have to look at maybe beyond this, even at the level of the AU, even in the sub-regional mechanisms like SADC, the harmonization of the WTO international health regulations and the Sendai framework, which is an international instrument that is used for disaster management. You'll find that the two are running parallel, but largely at the level of the AU, this was treated as a public health emergency. The Sendai framework mechanism that exists within the AU was not fully activated. So we need to see how we deal this. And it could be because, Mr. Chairman, I'm finishing, the whole idea, notion of disaster management in the AU and global is based on the supposition that the kind of disasters will be faced with is floods, it's fires, and so nobody, even if it was written in black and white, but in our own thinking and mentality and preparedness, we didn't prepare ourselves for a pandemic of this nature. We're thinking of fire, floods, and maybe earthquake there, maybe volcano, but not a pandemic. So even the whole Sendai framework is predicated on that notion of disaster. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And this is really to share, to say the APRM, we have this study going. And then we are also working on this disaster management or preparing of state issues of state resilience to incorporate them into the APRM methodology. And we'll be deploying our team very soon to Sierra Leone to test our tool. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, the EPRM, for giving us what is legislation is to national preparedness and the various other elements that need to be included in the preparedness for a pandemic or for a national disaster like this one. So thank you for that. And without further ado, let me introduce the next speaker, Dr. Raji Tajuddin, who is the head of Division of Public Health Institutes and Research for Africa CDC. The floor is yours, sir. You have 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My boss, Professor Maluka, CEO APRM, distinguished participants and participants who are also joining us online. So I will use this moment to share with you what we have done at Africa CDC. We highlight what has been the impact of this COVID-19. And of course, I will also use the opportunity to share with you what we think should be the next steps as far as responding to this COVID-19 pandemic. So as of today, we have over 1.6 million cases of COVID-19 on the continent, over 38,000 deaths. But the good thing is that our cases still remain under 5% of the global total. And in terms of death, we are somewhere around 3 to 4%. Furthermore, the other good thing is that over 83% of our cases have actually recovered. The continent has actually moved from over 120,000 cases per week to slightly over 50,000 per week. However, we are not yet out of the woods. The trajectory may seem to be going down, but we still have over 8,000 cases per day, which means that we need to continue to do what we are doing that is making us to be at this level. Now, let me shift gear and share with you what has been the impact as far as the continent is concerned of COVID-19. First and foremost, this COVID-19 has exacerbated the already existing inequality. Take, for instance, the issue of school closure. You will discover that for the apps, that's the well-to-do, they have access to the so-called distant learning platform. What about their cousins, their nephews, their relations in the community, in the village, who do not have access to this? So what happened to them? So if care is not taken, some of these children that are out of school will never return back to school. So we need to address this. 2, issue of food security. Is also a major concern as far as concerned. And a lot of studies are out there. For the sake of time, I will go into details of the modeling study or the forecasting that's come out if we do not do something to address the issue of COVID-19 pandemic. The third issue is issue of human rights. You will agree with me that the COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the issue of human rights. For instance, right to education, right to basic health. These are fundamental human rights that one way or the other have been affected by this COVID-19 pandemic. Issue of poverty. Over time, we have moved to try to eradicate poverty in the developing world, especially in Africa. Today, if care is not taken, these gains will be eroded. Take, for instance, more than 70% of our population are actually in the informal sector. Now you go lock down the countries, what happened for those people in the informal sector? These are people that cannot work remotely. The nature of their job, they only be able to put food on the table if they go out. But now there's lockdown, you cannot go anywhere. So what happened to them? So that means those 70% of people, whether we like it or not, the level of household, the household level of income will be dramatically affected. So the list continues like that. For instance, basic health services, childhood immunization, family planning, sexual and reproductive health rights. All these are one way or the other being affected. So, distinguished participants, let me share with you what have we done as Africa CDC. I think number one and most important thing is coordination. A week after we recorded the first case on the continent, African Union, through the Africa CDC, was able to bring all the ministers of health together to shed light on what do we need to do collectively. The previous speakers have highlighted the need for multilateralism, the need for coordination. And at that ministerial meeting, 4 key things were emphasized. 1, the need for coordination. Very, very important. No single country, no single individual can respond to this COVID-19 pandemic. We need to act fast and we need to act collectively. Number 2, collaboration. Again, emphasizing the need for us to work together. Number 3, cooperation. Very, very important. Communication. We need to know what is happening in our neighbor, so that we'll be able to know how do we work together to bring this COVID-19 pandemic under control. The same ministerial meeting also endorsed a continent-wide strategy, with input from member states. And this continent-wide strategy is being driven by a task force that was equally approved at that same ministerial meeting. Today, we have been able to move that coordination from ministerial level to the level of African Union, Bureau of Head of State and Government. I think we have to give credit to the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who has been able to drive this COVID-19 pandemic response on the continent with all the power we can imagine at his disposal. So number 2, our strategy underlined the need to 1, prevent transmission, very, very important. And that's the first thing if you really want to control this pandemic. 2, we need to prevent death. And number 3, in our strategy is the need for us to reduce as much as possible the social and economic harm, which underscore or which speak to the relevance of what we are here to discuss today. So in order to drive this strategy, Africa CDC rolled out a couple of initiatives. Again, I will emphasize on just few of them. One is that of partnership to accelerate COVID-19 testing on the continent. Underline that one. Partnership. Again, emphasizing the need to work together. And under this partnership to accelerate COVID-19 pandemic on the continent, we were able to accelerate or scale up testing. When this initiative was launched, as a whole continent, the rate of testing on the continent was less than 400,000 for the whole continent of 1.3 billion people. Today, I'm glad to inform you that we are over 16 million tests on the continent now, which speaks to the coordination, the collaboration. Number 2, the previous speakers have talked on the need to strengthen surveillance. So we'll also scale up our surveillance through all sort of capacity building exercise, supporting the vulnerable member states with the human resources to drive this, and also work with the private sector to be able to leverage technology to drive this surveillance. Then number 3 is to take care of the less than 20% of our cases that will require one form of medical intervention or the other, ranging from oxygen to mechanical ventilator and so on and so forth. Through this initiative, we were able to put in place a digitalized full procurement platform called African Medical Supply Platform. So with this platform, the issue of whether you are able to pay or not, is not a problem. So this actually ensures that each and every member state actually have access to the needed medical supply. Distinguished participants and colleagues, you will actually agree with me that one of the major and key challenges here with the response to this COVID-19 pandemic is the access to the medical supply. Again, this is where our African Continental Free Trade Agreement needs to come in. We believe that with AFCTA on board, that issue of access, at least we'll be able to read it to the barest minimum. So with that full procurement platform, most of our member states were able to access some of the medical supply. Number 3 on that initiative is human resources. We're able to take our response to the community level. So we supported member states with the deployment of community health workers. You build the capacity of all these are community health workers. Because for Africa CDC, one of the major things we were able to emphasize is the fact that both universal health coverage and global health security are two sides of the same coin. Whether you like it or not, you cannot focus on one and neglect the other. We need to combine the two together. So community health workers, today I'm happy to inform you that we have supported more than 32 member states with community health workers. We didn't just stop there, we also supported them with epidemiologists. Now, we know that one of the changes, or one of the things that will be able to bring this COVID-19 pandemic under control is that of COVID-19 vaccine. For most of us who have been following the politics around the COVID-19 vaccine, you will agree with me that if Africa, 1.3 billion population, 55 member states, we do not stand up, and approach this issue strategically at the highest political level, we will be left with a trickle down from this COVID, from the vaccine. In fact, we'll be left at the back of the queue. Go back to HIV/AIDS era. Most of the intervention, Africa only have access or had access to this, to the ART, the antiviral drug, 10 years after most of the developed world have gotten the access to the different interventions. So history must not repeat itself. So in this regard, Africa CDC has put in place a COVID-19 vaccine development and access strategy. And this is being driven at the highest level, again, under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa. We're able to engage at the global level, that's the COVAX facility, and we have also put in place our own complementary approach to what will come from the COVAX facility. We know that for us to come out of this pandemic, 60% of our population will be vaccinated. The information that we are getting from the COVAX facility in Geneva is that we'll be giving 220 million doses. Colleagues, what percentage is that? That means they will only give us what we've enough to vaccinate 10% of our population. So we have a gap of 50%. So this is the reason why, one, we need to continue to push that facility to increase our allocation. Two, we need to make sure that on our continent as well, come up with a complementary approach. So the COVID vaccine strategy emphasized 3 key things. One, the issue of development of this vaccine on the continent. Through one, to be part of the clinical trial, and much more importantly, which also fit into what we are doing here today, the leveraging what is at the disposal of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to mobilize our manufacturing capacity to also be able to produce part of this COVID-19 vaccine on the continent. So let me summarize by saying that the major ask for us, to the member states who are listening to this particular discussion is, one, we need to continue to support Africa CDC in a bid to accelerate our testing, surveillance, and treatment. Number 2, the whole of society approach, very, very important. Multi-sectoral approach, so everybody needs to be on board. Number 3, community engagement. We need to continue to carry our community along. Number 4, we should not forget that essential health services, very, very important. we should not only focus on COVID-19. There are other things in Africa, that will really, really, really affect our population. So we need to focus on those essential health services. Childhood immunization, sexual reproductive health, right, and so on and so forth. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Over.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Tajuddin, for that excellent, I think, summary, and also giving us a sense of where we are in terms of the overall COVID-19 impact health-wise in the continent and the efforts to bring member states together, but also to bring attention to coordination, mobilization, community engagement, and so on and so forth. Let me now introduce our next speaker, Reverend Dr. Fidon Mwambeki, who is the General Secretary of AACC. The floor is yours, sir, and you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not representing any government. I don't work in a governmental institution. I'm representing churches. Can you hear me? Therefore, my presentation is a little different. And I'm supposed to speak of what we have learned and how it can help us as we move ahead. And I would like to make 4 very quick points of what we, from the public, from the civil society, have seen as lessons which we really need for the future as we develop, and particularly in connection with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Number one, we think COVID has exposed that our governments are not quite serious when they agree on things. The integration of Africa is at stake, and they are not serious. What we have seen, the hindrances, the barriers, the borders, the closing of borders, a lot of people stuck on borders of one country and another, even in countries with sub-regional agreements like the East African Community, to which I belong. I live in Nairobi. And you see all these, whether you are going to Uganda or to Tanzania to Rwanda, Rwanda, Tanzania, everything was thrown out of the window, even though the agreements were clear. So we don't know when these people, our leaders, they meet in African Union. We are the AACC, the proponent of Agenda 2063. And some of those commitments which our governments have made in that Agenda 2063, like visa-free travel by 2018. We are asking, has 2018 arrived, or by them not yet? They have agreed on silencing the guns by 2020. Therefore, we are starting to wonder whether their signatures, when they meet and sign, they actually mean much. And therefore, should we really expect anything when it comes to the signatures and ratification and whatever you have on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? So that is our first lesson, that we beg and we plead with our government, when you sign, when you agree, please take it seriously. For us, our governments, when they sign and commit, we'd like to be able to trust. The second point, we think COVID-19 has revealed our fragility, or the fragility of the internal peace and security. There are some points which have been mentioned by my colleagues here, that countries have used, in some countries have used the situation of COVID-19 to actually violate people's human rights in their own countries on the pretense of enforcing and containment and all kinds of things like that. Political dissent has been, of course, stopped. You can't gather, you can't express yourself because of COVID. And even more serious has been the conduct of our security organs in some countries. How can you explain killing people by police because they violated the curfew? They're just late. And some of these had obvious reasons. There is no effective public transport. And where we were wondering, have these police who have been trained to quell the violence, have they been waiting to see when they will have a chance to beat people? so that now they have a pretense they can go out and pee and beat and actually even kill, but even sometimes extort money from the people because of the violations. This we have seen, and we think this is not a good thing for internal security and peace as we move on. The third, we have been amazed by African ingenuity, which has been manifested because of COVID-19. Because of these disruptions of supplies, many countries, and I'm happy that you have said it, have actually innovated through appropriate technology to produce what we need in Africa. I'm living in Kenya, and when I see that in the beginning we had plane loads of masks being shipped and being donated by some rich people in China and other places. But at the end, we see that all these things can be done, can be made, manufactured in Africa. It's not only about the vaccine, which I think I'm happy that the CDC is pushing that let us manufacture this. But also I have seen, for example, some very, technicians in Kenya who have innovated hospital beds, appropriate hospital beds, appropriate ventilators. The question which we are asking, do countries in Africa really trust? Does the country like Kenya actually give support, appropriate support to these individual poor people who are trying their best to use appropriate resources which are there? Do they get really boost? Or we are going to put all these barriers to one another, even with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, in order to continue buying and importing from China, from Europe, from US, everything, even the things which our countries can produce, by putting all these barriers of quality, of sourcing. So we are asking that let us use this lesson. And the fourth, and the last one, is that it has been our shock how the pandemic has revealed corruption in our countries, and that many countries have used the excuse of COVID to borrow more. But what is happening within countries is that even with this borrowing, actually, most of it is used corruptly, and other people are going to pay. Our grandchildren are going to pay. So we are requesting our leaders, please don't use the pandemic, and actually the bigger pandemic is corruption, and this appetite to national debts, which they use as a cover. Maybe they couldn't borrow before. Now, we need this and this because therefore we are saving lives, but they are squandering this money and as expecting our future generations to pay. We are requesting, be responsible, and let us fight corruption as even a worse pandemic than COVID-19 itself. Therefore, the All Africa Conference of Churches has launched a policy brief, which we call for a policy brief on debt, on public debt and corruption. These two are linked, and we are very sad that all these greedy people, they don't even care about the sick people. They borrow and take the money, and the people need them, they just don't get it. And this, we are really, really sorry. We think our governments are letting us down. Thank you very much.
For these very powerful words and reminders. I think governments of Africa should heed the call from men of God like you to make sure that in this time of pandemic that people are not taken advantage of. And now we have one final speaker, and I would like to welcome and call Dr. Giles Yabby, the founder of Wafi Citizen Think Tank in Senegal. And I believe you're joining us virtually. So thank you. The floor is yours, sir, and you have about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I hope that you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Clearly. Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to the Tana Forum. It's always a pleasure to be here. I would like to greet all the participants, the excellencies, Mr. Chairman, for this discussion, my fellow panelists as well. It's a great pleasure to be with you from Dakar. I will speak in French to bring some diversity to this discussion. So maybe I will allow you to take just a few seconds if you need to your headset. Given that I have just 7 minutes here, I think it will be easier in French so that I can share my observations very, very quickly. Merci beaucoup. Donc, si tout le monde a pu mettre le casque et la traduction en français. Donc, merci à nouveau pour l'invitation. C'est toujours un plaisir d'être associé à ce forum sur la paix et la sécurité en Afrique.
It's a pleasure for me to take part in this Tana Forum. This would be a third or fourth time I'm addressing you from Dakar. I wanted to share with you the following main remarks. I believe everybody can hear me now. So what I had to mainly say on this subject, what can we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic from the African continent perspective? Governance, sustainable development, angles come into play, and there is much to say. And I will do my level best to say so within the 7 minutes that have been allocated to me. Based on what we've learned from our representative from Africa CDC, the leading authority on health issues on the continent, I believe we need to salute the African CDC for the tremendous work that has been carried out since the beginning of this pandemic. I think it is worth noting that it is not every day that we can count on leading African authorities that are perceived as being efficient and serving African citizens. I think everybody had the opportunity to appreciate the leading position that the Africa CDC has taken in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic on the African continent. Two main aspects arise when we're thinking about what we have to learn from this. So first of all, when it comes to specific and useful, clear trajectories, when it comes to preventing illnesses, then this approach would have been very efficient. Secondly, those people leading this institution also come out because of their refined expertise, and this guarantees results. I think citizens today, African citizens today, feel confident that the adequate experts are leading in this authority that is the main authority working on the issues linked to the pandemic. My second point is to say that I believe many of us are thankful that we have managed to avoid so far the doom that was announced early on when the pandemic first struck worldwide. Although the number of cases is alarming in some parts of the continent, namely Southern and Eastern Africa. African resilience goes beyond the good measures that have been put in place. We also need to thank the right and appropriate strategies that were adopted early on. Let's take Senegal. Early on, we thought that the existing health system needed a makeover, and this is before COVID. And generally, health systems are considered to be very fragile. And this here is one good lesson, meaning the urgency of strengthening the existing health systems. And we should, of course, continue to remain thankful that these systems were not put to test by alarming COVID cases continent-wide. Thirdly, national resource mobilization. I believe we've seen many countries turn to advisors and experts, epidemiologists, to seek solutions, namely solutions for the economic crisis that came from the pandemic. This is, in a way, rare. It's not every day that we see high-level political will to turn to national collective resource mobilizing in search of solutions. Ideally, we shouldn't wait for crises and pandemics to turn towards a collective answer. We should have an ongoing structural approach to seeking such solutions, approaching the existing experts within our universities, our think tanks and research centers in order to continually search for adequate solutions. And coming to what the Reverend said earlier on corruption, obviously, when it comes to reform, our citizens are always quick to be skeptical and expect government funds to not be put to good use. And this is a perception that needs to change within the continent. Fifth point, and I believe this is one of the leading lessons from the pandemic. This pandemic has made us think over local production, whether it being pharmaceutical, drugs, or equipment. We have now thought again about the importance of local production. This is a great opportunity to recognize that this informal economy, which is the major component of our economy, should also be considered as one being a safeguard of stability and also a great potential to tap in. Sixth point, I would like to, of course, congratulate the work of Africa CDC, but also at regional level, there was a lot of political will and a lot of reactions from the entities. Initially, every country had their own airport rules when it came to testing, for instance, travel rules. Citizens had to bear the burden from the lack of coordination within a given region. And this is something that is noteworthy. And to keep within my 7 minutes, we are wondering collectively what lessons we have for peace and security post-COVID. And before the end of 2020, we started with Guinea. We are today very worried as to what will happen in Guinea post-elections, Ivory Coast and Burkina regarding the instability and increase of tourism. So before, during, and COVID, these are structural problems that do need addressing for the well-being of citizens, and this in a very sustainable manner. We do need to ask ourselves again and again on how to achieve good governance. Thank you for your attention, and I hope I didn't take too much of your time.
Dr. Giles, we really appreciate your intervention and also reminding us the diversity of language that exists also in the continent. So we have now concluded our initial interventions. We actually don't have much time, but I see there are a number of questions and comments that are already streaming through the messaging board. So I'll get right into it. The first question is actually for Dr. Gabriel and Reverend Mwambeki. And the question is, how can African governments leverage gains from free movement of labor as espoused by the AU and IGAD protocols of free movement while addressing the risks brought about by COVID-19? Maybe Dr. Gabriel, you can take that question first, because I think it's all very pertinent to what you do at IGAD as well. Dr. Gabriel, are you still there with us?
Yes, I am. Can you repeat, please, the question? Or me, I'm sorry, I'm not listening.
Sure. So the question is, how can African governments leverage gains from free movement of labor as espoused by the African Union and IGAD protocols of free movement while addressing the risks brought about by COVID-19?
Thank you very much. In fact, this morning we were launching the IOM Continental Strategy on Migration for Africa, and I was stating about the importance of the free movement of people. While we are advocating about the free trade, one thing that we have missed is the free movement of people. Yes, indeed, the issue of COVID is there. The most important thing here that I want to stress is for me at least, no one knows that where is post-COVID, and the term post-COVID is also misleading. So there should be strategy how to live side inside while we are fighting with COVID, how to enhance our economy. To enhance our economy, the free movement of people as well as trade, it is two things which should go side by side. I'm very happy that the free movement of these trade issues are going very well. Most of the countries have signed this issue, but the free movement of people issues is still a challenge for Africa. So, but the most important thing is dealing with the states, putting a mechanism to how to protect the life and the health of the citizens, side by side, how to promote the free movement of people is a very important thing. You know, we can think of about the PPEs, how to protect our citizens, but we cannot isolate ourselves and we cannot confine ourselves and live the way we are doing. So there should be a mechanism. So that is what I suggest. Thank you.
An excellent way to reflect on it. Reverend, would you like to quickly respond to that? Yes, we can hear you.
Cross-border violence. But this is, we think, what our governments are supposed to be doing. As civil society, we don't know how, but we think our governments should address these issues, but not make them an excuse for not abiding by what they commit to.
A question, Professor Dr. Amaloko, about data protection. You remember the Reverend earlier talked about technologies for COVID-19, and someone asked you the question, you know, in the absence of a data protection legislations for most African countries, how can we make sure that these apps that we're now being forced to download from our member states are not utilized for other reasons, security reasons, and so on? I think there is exploitation for that, and I think you are the right person to answer that because your job is partially to streamline policies across the continent. It's a tough question, I know. I think someone should give you the
technical. I think our technical solution probably not African technology.
I think now you don't.
But in the spirit of what my colleague from CDC was talking about, this passionate call for Africa really to be proactive on the issue of the vaccine. I think the same should go. I'm not really a fan of the so-called fourth industrial revolution because the way it's been put forward, conceptualized, articulated, and the policy measures that are being thrown at us, they basically involve integrating us into a technology platform which is foreign, which is not African. Africans, we don't even have WhatsApp type of, we don't even have Facebook, we don't have, all these things are not African. So the issue that you are talking about is much broader than that. Is really how Africa can think about the box, about the so-called fourth industrial revolution. That it must be based on African technology platform. Not that we'll do what Samir Amin talked about. What is it? Delinking, no. But we are learning now. We realize now that this technology platform don't come cheap, and they are not geologically innocent. That they can be weaponized, they can be used for other geological leverages. So really, And that's what I'm talking about, what Tajuddin was talking about, the issues around us Africans really looking at self-reliant interventions and the self-reliant part in how we approach the issue of vaccine. We should not be waiting for somebody to come in and bring something here that we ourselves, we have. It doesn't, I don't think it's something the Reverend may give us a verse in the Bible that may help us lead us in the right path. But it's not something we need to go to the moon for. It's something that we Africans have to start realizing that the path to our future and how we claim the 21st century is not by relying more and more on external people. No matter what the good intentions that they have, but really to look at the endogenous and African solutions to it and try to bring together our own scientists. Let's find the vaccine ourselves. Let's not, these dosages will come, as you say, to just be 10%. And also the technology platform. I can tell you, there are so many companies here. Even in Nigeria, I was listening. People can do the apps, the WhatsApp types, these Facebooks. These technologies are so diffused that we can be able to develop our own technology platform. But we need a continental approach. So even if it goes to the issue of, like now we are talking on this, people are talking, somebody's listening to us. These are not African technology platforms. Even our own cabinets are meeting using these platforms. So really the issue of African technology platform as the basis for the fourth African industrial revolution, for me, I think that's the path to go. But unfortunately, it's a discussion that we must still engage in as Africans. When we're thinking a fourth industrial revolution, is the same approach we have towards vaccine. We're waiting for somebody to bring us dosages and come and deliver them here in Addis. We're not thinking about mobilizing the African potential and African capabilities to do this thing. We have to do things for ourselves, really, to claim the 21st century. That's really my view. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Relying on ourselves, there's a question Tajuddin, relating to you earlier mentioned that there is an effort by your center to try to coordinate efforts to combat COVID-19. So what has been the response so far? And especially keeping in mind, someone asked the irregular migration that happens all across the continent, but probably mainly within regions. But what are the so far coordination efforts that have taken place?
So in terms of optics, I want to just emphasize as I said, the coordination. We have approached bottom-top approach to make sure that before any strategy is rolled out, member states have actually made their input. Number two, we also make sure that there is a clear-cut community engagement. There's a sort of an avenue to really carry the community along in everything that we do, including the traditional rulers, the religious leaders, different civil society organizations. So that, much I can say that yes, the uptake has been quite good. In terms of the regional coordination and the issue of you have continental free trade agreement, there is no movement of people. Yes, we cannot have free movement of goods without free movement of people. It's just not possible. It's not going to work. So and in this regard, I think I know part of the efficacy, Africa, flagship, the 10-year flagship project is to ensure that we have one single passport. So a lot of discussion is still going on there, and I believe with time, I think we'll be able to get there. Now, for Africa to navigate this particular difficult terrain is to encourage as much as possible regional coding, regional integrated surveillance and lab network. Whereby we bring the different countries within that region together with the rest, to really discuss and agree on harmonized standard, on how do you go about surveillance, how do you go about testing, how do you go about, treatment. So, and this has actually worked with a lot of, regions. Because the good thing going for us in Africa is that we have very, very strong regional economic community. And Africa CDC, through its political leadership, have been able to leverage on the different platforms and resources at the regional economic. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, excellent response. I see no more questions. So what I would like to do is to give each of our panels this about 2 minutes of closing statements. We don't have any closing statements. Well, maybe others would do. To sort of wrap up, I think what we've heard is from both civil society, from governments, but also from RECs like IGAT. And so, Dr. Yabby, if you allow me, I'll give you the floor first to give you about 2 minutes of a closing statement, reflecting on what you've heard so far, and the way forward in terms of how we ensure that there's effective governance and sustainable peace and development in Africa within COVID-19 environment. Over to you.
Thank you very much, my brother. Yes, the most important point is just dealing with the COVID and the impact of COVID that we are living in. Our continent, especially this region, is really facing a triple challenges that I have mentioned. IGAD is very happy to be to constitute REC of the African continent in different areas, especially in free trade area. We are now members of the biggest free trade area of the continent that connects 55 countries and creates collective markets of 1.3 billion people. This is approximately 70% of the global population. As you know, our population in Africa is roughly equivalent to China. Our collective economy of 3.4 trillion US dollar is 4 times smaller than China, 4 times smaller than Europe, and 6 times smaller than the United States. In terms of our region, IGAD is very ready to join hands to work with other 7 RECs in terms of real approach to combat the challenges that we are facing, that is COVID, patient security, food security, and other natural disasters and man-made challenges, and especially the governance issues, the democracy issues, and some of the conflicts that we are seeing. There must remain the point is it should remain the center of the implementation. All this we have agreed. I think we intend to do this the first and foremost by strengthening cross-border cooperation by connecting communities. We have already formulated a protocol of free movement of persons and other protocol of transhuman or pastoralist communities. So IGAD will recognize the importance of working with our people to strengthen informal cross-border trade and at the same time bringing into the mainstream economy. The most important thing, as my colleague from one of the presenters has said, this is a time to coordinate our efforts. The challenges are in different dimensions and in different angles. So this is a time to bring multilateral organizations, regional, as well as member states, bilateral cooperations, and private sectors to work together to combat the challenge that we are facing. So definitely the human community, the humankind will prevail this challenge as well as, and definitely we can see and we can visibly can we predict the world after COVID. Even if we are now the way how we are working. Thank you very much, my brother.
Thank you very much for that very brief intervention. Dr. Giles, Yabby, your 2 minute closing remarks, please.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Je retourne au français juste pour dire quelques mots et pour dire en fait que les moments de crise finalement ne sont pas suivis de miracles, c'est-à-dire que c'est les pays qui sont les mieux préparés,
Thank you for allowing me the floor. ideally, when faced with multiple crises, we already have the necessary tools on hand. Now, in our case, regional coordination needs to be strengthened, as well as existing mechanisms for African integration will be needed to come into play simultaneously. Now, coming to our context, it seems to me that there are a certain number of components that we need to highlight. We need not only to come up with the right strategies, but know how to implement them. And then, as you very well know, African continent is celebrated for its many strategies, and however, the implementation always remains lacking. We do need high quality public policy. This is one of the main challenges. The second idea is the political authority of these states. Democracy, democratic space for civil society deserves central position at the negotiating table. And as it was said, there are a certain number of countries today that are very far from this, and numerous countries today are showing us that civil society has a shrinking space as the years go by. This being said, the continent's youth will definitely push us to stop our ancient practice of extra long mandates. And to make my remarks short, thank you so much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
But thank you for that. Reverend, would you like, a lot of people actually commended you for your powerful intervention on the message board, so if you want to have closing remarks.
I would like to say Africa, full of people believing God, of different religions. Let us thank God that our impact has not been as bad as it could have been, as many other continents predicted about Africa. We are thankful to God. But secondly, therefore, let us not use COVID-19 as an excuse not to do what we are supposed to do, but to show us what we are not doing well and actually do better. Let us not use COVID-19 to excuse our governments actually from doing what they are going to. We as the people would like very much to know when our governments speak, when they are at AU, when they, wherever, in the regional economic blocks, when they agree on something, they mean it. But if they put all this down in us, even the Africa continental free trade area, we don't know what to believe and what not to believe. So we really urge, please get committed and get committed to Africa. And the last one is that Africa needs Pan-Africanist leaders who are committed to the continent, who are not scared of the challenges, but who are willing to move forward with integration, even in the face of all these problems we see. Problems are there to be solved, and that's why we elect them.
Thank you for reminding us to. Thank you, reminding us to thank God. Dr. Tajuddin, very briefly, if you can take a minute or two.
And number one, we need to strengthen our health system. Number two, we need to strengthen our systems for health. And the best way to go about it is to have in place what we call a National Public Health Institute. Number two, we need to leverage the opportunity that is provided by Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to make sure that we build our manufacturing capacity. Number three, the issue of data governance, very, very important. You cannot do any policy, you cannot do any strategy without data. So we need data that will allow us to come up with a robust and comprehensive policy and strategy. Number four, we need to recognize that health is a security issue. Health is a developmental issue, and we need to treat health as such. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand back to the organizers. And thank you all for your time and for listening.
Moderator, I'm going to make a special request that's not on the program, and I trust that you will understand the spirit within which this is made. I'm going to request the panelists and the delegates in the room to kindly stand. Kindly stand on your feet. Yeah. The month of October is a particularly heavy month in the calendar of Pan-Africanism. Today and tomorrow we'll be commemorating the 75th anniversary of the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress held in Manchester, at which the decision to undertake the liberation of Africa was made, which reflected an alliance between diasporan Africans and African nationalists. But the month of October is also special in many ways. Whatever we may think of certain leaders, I wish to give you a roll call, a roll of honor of some of the leading Africans that met their demise in October. I will start with President Samora Moises Machel of Mozambique, who perished in an air crash on the 19th of October 1986, brutally murdered by the apartheid regime in South Africa. And cross over to Grenada to acknowledge Maurice Bishop, who was executed on the 19th of October 1983 by a machine gun. And then cross to Rwanda, Fred Rwejema, who was the leader of the RPF, who met his demise in the battlefield on the 2nd of October 1990. Cross to Egypt, Muhammad Anwar el-Sadat, who met his demise on the 6th of October 1981, and Prince Louis Rwagasore of Burundi, who was assassinated whilst having dinner on the 13th of October 1961, and no other than Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania, who passed on to glory on the 14th of October 1999, and cross over to Burkina Faso, Captain Thomas Sankara, who was assassinated on the 15th of October 1987, and cross to Ghana, Ya Asantewa, one of the heroines of African liberation, who died on the 17th of October 1921. And one of the biggest advocates for what we now will discuss as a reality, which was the Continental Free Trade Agreement or area and Africa's independence, was Muhammad Abu Anya Gaddafi of Libya, who was executed on the 20th of October 2011. And of course, Hendrik Witbooi of Namibia, who also died in this month. Often, because of what we discussed in earlier sessions, we forget that these imperfect men and women who were committed to the cause of Pan-Africanism, some died at the brutal hands either of opponents, foreign and domestic. I just asked us to stand in order to honor that what we're going to witness this week is progress that they did not see in their lifetime, but progress that they hoped and wished for. And to remind ourselves that the Tana Forum, though informal, what we are discussing about the self-reliance, the governance, is something that's been built on the blood and sweat of men and women. some with outstanding names like this, and others whose names are not known. I thank you for honoring the fallen heroes and heroines. I hope as you reflect this evening, their memory will not be in vain. And as we reflect this week, we will have the seriousness of understanding that whilst Tana is informal and our discussions are collegial, we are about the business of liberating the continent. May God bless you. May you live long. See you tomorrow. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening.